Candy and I will be starting to talk about the role of support persons for the individuals who are parties involved in the sexual misconduct. Response team members offer individual support, as you've heard, to all of the principal parties involved in cases of clergy sexual misconduct, including the victim survivor or complainant, their spouse, the accused clergy, their spouse, family members. Candy and I are going to first be talking about supporting the complainant or survivor. We use the word complainant instead of victim now for a number of reasons. Sometimes the complainant or person making the formal allegation is not the direct victim of the sexual misconduct. It could be a spouse or family member of that person. It could be another person from the church who had knowledge of what was going on between the pastor and the victim survivor. Also, we have kind of moved away from using the word victim because it feels disempowering to people. And so these days I use and hear more often the term survivor when we refer to those who are directly harmed by the misconduct. Another important designation is that of advocate for the complainant or survivor. When I was first trained in the early 1990s, that was the designation for the person who was working with the victim survivor, advocate. And we've kind of moved to the use of this term support persons, but I think exclusively in our work with the victim survivor, we like to retain the term advocate because it's important that we keep this concept of advocacy when we talk about the work with survivors. Many of these folks need more than just listening and emotional support. They really need us to be advocates for them through the process. I think, Sue, you may have mentioned as part of some of what you were discussing the time when you accompanied a woman to a meeting that involved the cabinet where you really needed to advocate for the person, because these folks often do not know much about the discipline process. They're frequently confused and lost and feeling very alone. And so having an advocate in their support person can be very helpful to navigate the whole discipline process. So sometimes we really have to stand up for the victim survivors. Not as much now with our current cabinet members, but certainly many of us have done that in the past. And other parties whom we support typically don't need advocacy in the same way. When we're dealing with the accused, for example, we don't use the term advocate because we don't want to be seen in the position of advocating for someone who's caused harm, but we certainly can support that person. Of all of those affected by the misconduct with whom the team works, the person who is the victim survivor is really the most, I think, labor and time intensive. These folks are usually willing to accept support from us, not always. Sometimes because they are feeling loyal to the clergy person, maybe not even seeing themselves as a victim, they may refuse our support. But many of them are very appreciative of the care and support because they're feeling so alone and confused and overwhelmed. And we want to make sure that we keep in mind that these are people who've experienced trauma. even if the misconduct is not a sexual assault, the shock, the trauma of the discovery of the relationship, the shock of family and church members finding out about this, frequently the abrupt termination of what they have considered a special relationship is very traumatic. So survivors can be shut down, sometimes unable to really talk about what happened, at times very ashamed, angry, depressed. Those are all common trauma responses, and we really need to be aware of how fragile at least some of these folks may be when we encounter them, and how easily they may be re-triggered by the whole process of working through the discipline, the judicial process for the conference. Among the benefits of providing support for the complainant is that it very much expedites their healing to have representatives of the church where they've been harmed offering compassion and support. When they don't feel listened to and supported by the church, the emotional and spiritual damage is likely to be much worse. I think we've seen that in some of the testimony, the stories that have been in the news lately about survivors of abuse by Catholic priests. And as Sue was talking about and telling us, and I really appreciated those stories that you shared of the women who had given you feedback about their experiences of having been survivors and been accompanied by somebody from the team. I worked once with a woman who had been, after the disclosure of a relationship, she'd been hospitalized. And as she was coming out of the hospital, I was assigned to be her support person advocate. And she was really in a very difficult place at that point in her life, and she had, prior to going into the hospital, made contact with an attorney with plans to file a lawsuit against the pastor, the church, the conference. And I didn't really address that with her, but through our relationship over several months, and her experience of feeling like the church took her complaint seriously, and that we were responsive to her and caring for her. She was one of those who was offered counseling, having counseling paid for, and she took advantage of that. She really came to a place of significant healing over quite a few years. She dropped the lawsuit. Interestingly, she has become a mental health professional since that time, and she and I have stayed in touch for, that case took place, gosh, I think 15 years ago maybe. So the experience of being cared for and listened to is very powerful. So as I think you mentioned, Sue, you know, we're not offering help to these folks to avoid lawsuits, but it certainly is one of the bonuses and the benefits. We'd like you to take a look at some of the material that you have in the binder. Let's see, I think it's under the section entitled, "What is a Support Person?" So I'll speak first to the, let's see, the page that says, "What is an advocate?" We're not going to go through everything in here, but we want to highlight just some things in these handouts that tell you about this role of an advocate for the complainant or the survivor. It's important to realize, especially for those of us who are professional counselors, that this is not a role as a counselor. You are a listener primarily, listening to the story without judgment, giving the person the message that their story is important. When I was first trained in this process of advocacy, they said, support the survivor by believing her story. And over time, that's changed. It's not that we disbelieve, we honor the story, but we reserve judgment. Recently, there was some discussion about an allegation that came forward that was not substantiated. So you need to be, listening supportively, but not necessarily extend, you believe their perspective 100%. Providing resources and referrals is a big part of what we do, helping people to understand the power dynamics that several people have talked about already, to minimize that sense of self-blame, accompanying the survivor to meetings, and sometimes representing that person when necessary in dealing with cabinet members, for example, and helping to protect that person from re-victimization. Haven't seen that as much recently, but in the past, the process at times can feel hurtful, abusive, having to tell one story to another male pastor if a male pastor has been the abuser. Can be traumatizing, re-traumatizing to some of these folks. So as an advocate for a survivor, trying to educate the cabinet member sometimes, other people in the process, to know what to expect from somebody who's experienced trauma. One of the things that you'll find in this handout, What is an Advocate, number 9, modeling healthy boundaries. This is important because some of these people are very much needing a lot of help and support, and so once they begin to trust you, maybe calling and texting and wanting to get in touch more perhaps than you have time available. So setting healthy boundaries is appropriate. Letting people know, for example, if you need to get in touch with me, please call me before 9 o'clock at night, or call me after work, that kind of thing, so that folks know that they're connected, but also that there are appropriate boundaries and that you're not the only one available to support them. And that's another reason for referring them for counseling. And at the very end, I know, Candy, you're going to talk about the importance of listening.
Yes, if I can say one thing that will stick in your mind, it will be listen, 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 and realize that many times we want to fix things. We want to say, did you think of this or whatever. The most important thing, I think, is just to be present and listening and allowing the person to process whatever they need to share. There is a paper in your book. It's a little different than this, perhaps, but a support person is an ally, a listener, a helper, a protector, a clarifier, a comforter, a supporter. As the support person, we are not the judge or jury. We are not a therapist. We are not a lawyer. We are not the decision maker. We're not a mediator. We're not always appreciated by the person for whom we are advocating. And we're not always popular among our colleagues. You just have to realize that. And as I've been sitting here today, I'm thinking, I've been through training now probably 4 or 5 times. Every time we do this, I gain more, and it gives me just knowledge for the next time that I will be called. There's also in your booklet, under the same heading, Responsibilities of an Advocate Support Person. I'm not going to read all these, but I just want to highlight a few. Take seriously the survivor's account of what happened. Now, Wendy said, listen to it, not necessarily totally believe everything, but take it seriously. Be present and let the person know that person is your main concern and your main listening. And many times, I think many times it'll be over the phone, but there may be some times that you would be one-on-one, which, just your body contact, just the way you interact will help them to know that you are really listening. Don't be surprised if they express rage or anguish or guilt or all the type things that may, when they feel safe, they're going to probably process feelings and let a lot out. Respect the survivor's feelings about the offender. They may still be very much emotionally themselves involved, and it can take not just weeks or months, it can take years to really process a situation, and many times it's taken place over a period of time, not necessarily just weeks or months, but perhaps longer. The other thing is very important. If you haven't heard from the person that you're supporting, check in with them from time to time. When I've done it, I sort of in my mind, I put it on my calendar, and if I hadn't heard from the person within so many weeks, I would give them a call and just check in and say, do you need to talk? How's it been going? And just let them know you're thinking about them and you're there for them. And keep confidence. In other words, let me read this one. Do not discuss the survivor's identity or story with anyone, including your spouse, if you feel there is a valid reason why someone should be shared something with a third party. Get the survivor's specific permission. So that, we are their support person in confidence, but there may be something that comes up. We're not doing an investigation, but we have, at times, things have come to the surface that perhaps would help the case, and getting their permission is very important, that you can be shared.
I think the only other thing I might highlight here is the issue of trust, that because these folks have experienced betrayal of trust, it can be hard for them to trust, and it can take a long time. So don't expect that will be established quickly when you begin to work with somebody who has been harmed by misconduct. It may take quite a while for them to be willing to open up and fully trust you. And so the next thing that we're going to talk about is being a support person for the spouse of the accused and the spouse of the survivor. I don't have a lot regarding these two roles, because typically folks in these positions, frequently, I should say, will refuse help. You have to keep in mind, though, that the spouses and families of the accused are also victims. I mean, these are people who usually didn't know anything about what was happening behind the scenes with the clergy person, and so suddenly their lives are turned upside down by the clergy person being put on leave and possibly surrendering credentials and losing their place, their home, their support through their place of worship, their income. So, they are very much affected by this, and there have been a number of them who've accepted support from us. The downside is that we can't keep confidence with these folks, and you'll hear Tom, I think, talking a little more about this issue. When you are assigned as a support person from the team, because we are extensions of the bishop's office, we can't extend confidentiality to the folks that we're working with. So, for example, in the case of the spouse of the accused, that person is going to be reluctant to talk to us about, in the case of a male clergy, say, her suspicions of something going on between her husband and someone else, because she would be concerned about the impact that would have on her husband. So very frequently, once they find out that we can't keep what they share with us entirely confidential, not uncommonly, people will decline the offer of help as a support person.
May I ask?
Sure.
When a support person is offered, and so I'm wondering procedurally if this comes then from the convener or from the support person, how is that kind of boundaries of that relationship established so that the person who is being supported knows that there isn't an expectation of confidentiality and those pieces? How is all of that established?
Well, I think sometimes, I'm not sure how you do it, Elaine. I know that in the past, Sharon would tell people that she was offering a support person to kind of walk through the process and be there, but define the role before the first introduction actually took place, so that the person on the other end understands that from the get-go, because otherwise it can lead to feelings of betrayal if they start to disclose information and then realize, oh, this person is not going to keep it confidential.
Right, that's what
And the few times I've done it, the first time it ever actually happened, I was working with the respondent, and up to that time, we still were working with the sense of confidentiality, that anything said in that, and that person knew that because I had shared that. When that took place, when there was a shift and we were told we could no longer keep confidentiality, the next meeting I had with the person, I explained that to them. And immediately the person just shut down. And so thereafter, but I have done the same. The few that I've done after that was just to right up front say, I'm here to support you. I'm here to help guide you through the process, because even pastors don't necessarily know the discipline. So to help guide you through that. But right up front say, you need to be aware that what is said here is not done in confidentiality. So I just want you to be mindful of that when we speak.
So a person's being supported might then actually hear that multiple times from the initial offer from the support person, him or herself.
Right.
Perfect.
Right.
But if the person doesn't feel comfortable, would you refer them out to another, to an agency that does?
We would offer counseling to those folks. So if they want to talk to somebody and have confidentiality, absolutely, they would be referred to a counselor so that they have a place where they can talk about all of that. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Candy?
Not really. Everything I was thinking of has been brought out.
Okay. The other person who we offer support to is the spouse, at times, the spouse of the survivor. And there are some of those folks who really want support, and many of them need education about power dynamics, because they look at this as an affair, and they might have a tendency, well, sometimes they're blaming the pastor, but sometimes they will blame their spouse equally. And part of what we do over time, not right away, usually in the beginning we're just listening to their grief and pain and anger, but eventually trying to help them understand how their spouse was vulnerable to the boundary crossing of the clergy, so that they understand the extent to which their spouse was victimized.
You may want to say something also, Wendy, that in the case of, pardon? Oh, okay, outside voice. In the case of the spouse of the respondent and children, but particularly the spouse, what they are hearing from their spouse may be quite different than the facts.
Yes.
And I've had to deal with one in that situation. You know, the spouse is taking her husband's word for everything. And, you know, she didn't believe any of the stuff that was going on, and everybody was wrong. And so that makes it difficult too. Because if the pastor is unwilling to owe up to his responsibility, doesn't mean that the wife is going to be any better. I mean, she denied right to the end that he was guilty of any of these things, despite the evidence.
Jerry Sandusky's
And we're in an awkward position then as the supporter of that person, because we really can't disclose details that we've learned about the what really happened.
Right.
So it's a very difficult position when the spouse is not telling the truth to his or her spouse about what really happened. I think you may be, are you the next person, Tom, who's talking about?
supporting respondent. I'm gonna go up there.
Now,
Well, you need a mic. You have to have a mic.
I'll just stay here if that's all right. As Wendy and Candy pointed out, working with the respondent is a little different than working with the survivor, in that our role is to be supportive and to guide them through the process. And in that same section that Wendy had spoken to, what is the sponsor? There's an article, What Does It Take to Do This Work? And there's a few things in there I just want to highlight. Certainly the ability to listen. And in listening, that means withholding judgment. We've had one instance that I know of that the complaint was not substantiated and the pastor was innocent. But it's hard for that pastor to understand because he's been suspended, he's publicly been defamed, there is a complaint against him of sexual misconduct. It's affected his wife, his livelihood, his children, all of that. Because I remind you that anybody can sign a complaint. This isn't a case where there's an investigation done and based upon the facts, then you sign a complaint. Anybody can sign a complaint. And with that signed complaint, the pastor is suspended. So in that case, working with the pastor is quite different than working with the pastor who is guilty. In fact, most of the pastors who are guilty will decline a respondent. And eventually they just hand in their credentials. They don't want to go through the mess of all of that. So they just decline a respondent. I've only worked with, I think, 3, maybe 4 over the, 18 years I've been involved in it. Another one that I point out, particularly among clergy persons, is that you may be working with somebody you know. It's one thing to work with a clergy person you don't know, but in my 41 years, I've had 5 pastors who, not all United Methodists, but in my earlier years, I belonged to an ecumenical group, had one who, during our time, was arrested for pedophile, being a pedophile, another one for having an affair with his organist, who in that case was a Lutheran. The church forgave him and allowed him to continue if he would confess to the congregation and swear it would not happen again. Now, they were following what they felt. They didn't have safe sanctuaries or any of this stuff in place. And to be fair, this is my earlier, we didn't have any of this stuff either. This goes back to the days when we were doing the crazy stuff we were doing. But they allowed him to come back. And he continued serving for another 6 months until he was found out the affair never stopped. You know, so my point is, and these were people I would have trusted with my life. these were close colleagues of mine. And so it can happen to anyone, particularly as clergy. And when you're sitting there working with somebody that you know, in a sense, it's almost like being victimized yourself. It really is a betrayal of trust and all that you've known about them. Being open to the possibilities, well, I did look at that. We did mention briefly about the confidentiality. It is different when you're working with a respondent. That I shared that when I was working with someone, before that had become the policy, the person was sharing things with me, and I was building that relationship. But when I had to come back and say there's been a change, and anything you say forth, I can't hold in confidence, the person just shut down. He said, I don't see a need to continue this relationship. And so most of the time when I've been assigned, I just keep in touch. Very few times does a relationship ever form. I will call and say, haven't heard from you, just wondering how things are going. But yeah, things are fine, we're okay, we're getting along, And I would do that for a period of weeks, maybe months, but it never really went anywhere. So it's a totally different kind of relationship when you're dealing with the respondent than with other victims. That said, I remind that this person may, in fact, be innocent, in which point they want somebody to talk to. They want somebody to talk to and hear them and to help guide them through this process, because they're going to be going through this process just the same as somebody who's guilty. And it is just a totally different kind of animal when you're working with the respondent, and being mindful of that. Mike, maybe, I don't know if you've dealt with a few, maybe you want to add anything to that.
Oh, who's next?
Yeah.
You're next anyways.
I'm next anyway.
Oh, he's next.
Yeah, I think I've been called on to work with 4 people who were identified as, offenders, and only 2 of them did I have conversation with, and only 1 of those 4 did I have multiple conversations with about, and that was the one where the guy was innocent. And he, and so you're right, he wanted to talk. He wanted to have somebody to, to help him cope with what was going on. And he was the one guy who was not, and it was interesting. I sat in on a meeting there, and the first meeting I had with that particular case, it took me all of 5 minutes to figure out this guy's innocent. There's something wrong here, and it's not with him. So anyway, when we're dealing with support people, often we're thinking about the victim and the complainant and the respondent, and we're thinking about the church. But there's also the pastor who comes in after this pastor, and call him the after pastor. That person can need some support and some attention too. If you look in your binders, there's a tab called Conflict Management. In that tab, there is 1 page, and I'd like you to, for the moment, flip that page over to the back side, where it says After Pastor. There's just a statement there that I wrote about After Pastor. I've had the opportunity to serve in that role, and as I did, I was placed in that role because I was a member of this team. And I was a member of the team who had not been a part of the response team, that had gone to that church for the meetings and so on. And it was really helpful. The most helpful thing, the thing that I knew and that I reminded myself of every day, and I was at this church for a year, the thing I reminded myself of every day was, I don't have to fix everything. I don't have to fix everything. My duty and my responsibility here is fairly closely prescribed and fairly simple. And that's what I wrote this statement about. The after pastor is facing a wounded community, a fearful gathering, a church out of balance. Their need is to be refocused on their mission and their ministry. The after pastor needs to provide a, quote, steady hand on the rudder. We used to talk about, when I was in school, we talked about a non-anxious presence. Guiding with grace and hope while he or she helps the congregation to look forward again. You know, the worst thing that an after pastor could do, I didn't do this, is to stand up in front of a congregation on their first day and say, oh my goodness, I've just gotten here and there's so much to do and I just don't know where to start and I'm going to need your help. And that kind that's the worst thing you can do. Some graceful confidence, not arrogance, but graceful confidence and non-anxious presence are the most important things. To help a congregation to regain their balance, to regain their focus, and to begin to move forward again. The last thing I said in this statement is, often the after pastor will find this attitude. We know we can't get stuck here. We have to move forward, but we don't know how. There's some things you can fix. When I went into the congregation I served, first administrative council meeting, the treasurer looked at me and said, I have 2 questions for you, and we'll find out very quickly how well you're going to do here. I said, okay. She said, since last fall, our circumstances have changed radically. We no longer have a full-time pastor. We no longer have all of the members and the income we had. I think it would benefit this church to have a new budget based on these current circumstances, but we've been told that we have to live by the budget we constructed last fall for the new year. But I think we should have a new one. And I said, of course you can have a new budget. Of course you can. She said, that's one. You know, some stuff you can fix and it's easy. But there were lots of things I found in this church that needed attention and needed to be fixed. I couldn't do all of that. But I could help them, and I could help them in the best way they could be helped by providing a graceful, non-anxious presence and helping them recover their focus on mission and ministry, which they did incredibly well when they were settled and focused on it. But as support people and advocates, that's what we can do to be helpful to an after pastor. Help them remember, stay focused. You can't fix everything, but your presence here is vitally important to the healing and the recovery of this congregation.
Now, Mike, you
Yes.
can't leave us hanging. What was number 2?
Oh, number 2 was, this treasurer was something else. She was great. She said, we have our books audited at a cost of $250 a month.
What?
And I said, wait a minute, you have your books audited every month? She said, that's what it amounts to. It's an audit every month, and we pay $250 for that. And she said, I don't think that's necessary. And I said, well, let me tell you this. I just came from serving a congregation probably about 10 times your size. And we never spent that kind of money on an audit and never did it monthly. I think you can deep six that.
Yeah, really.
That was the second. So she said, that's 2. We're going to get along just fine.
Can I just make a comment about after pastors? I'm sure, Sue, you have a lot you could add to this, but that it's very common for after pastors to get a lot of the anger focused on them that people feel about what happened to their previous pastor.
Right.
And so, you know, supporting an after pastor involves helping that person expect and handle that anger and understand that it really isn't about them most of the time. It's really deflected anger. They're kind of scapegoats for the anger that congregants have about what happened.
And I have another story, I have a very poignant story I'm going to tell you about just that thing at the beginning of my next segment, which is conflict management.
Okay. I just,
You know, but something came to mind while you were talking, and that was, and in my own experience, and that is, I remember somebody telling me years and years ago that the ones who will fall are the brightest and the best. And, you know, of the 5 that I spoke to, 3 of them were well known in their denomination, highly recognized in the big steeple. And I even come back to just recently for those who have been influenced, as I was in my early years, with what's the one in Chicago?
Willow Creek.
Willow Creek. You know, Bill Hybels having to retire early. So that one of the things that it taught me, none of us are immune from this. And no matter how good or successful we may consider ourselves, none of us are immune. And the ones who do fall, they are often the brightest and the best, where you would think they know better. Well, one of the things that I learned early in my career was sin warps our thinking. And I used to preach that. Sin warps our thinking. And we don't think straight. When we are being tempted, you don't think straight anymore. And it's only, you know, afterwards, you hear people say, "What was I thinking?" Well, you weren't thinking straight. You know, that's the nature of sin.
That's why they go for potato chips.
This is one of the reasons that Kathy has asked for, at the end of the boundaries training, asked for people to, who will keep you accountable.
Right, I think that's
And
great.
so that the what was I thinking kind of thing will be, maybe someone else can see that you're not thinking straight. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we also, with after pastors, the cabinet process is when somebody is appointed serving in an after capacity, that pastor knows that he or she is going into that situation. That has not always been the case.
That's right.
And the other piece is that we had 20, 30 some people that the annual conference had offered interim ministry training, and that does include the opportunity for a person to serve following some sort of misconduct, knowing that that pastor is going in an interim basis, and there is some training that has existed. The conference is taken very seriously, wanting to make sure that pastors are as best equipped and supported who are serving in those capacities, because it's not an easy ministry to serve as an after pastor.
There's a specific contract for that.
Yes, a contract is written up for interim ministry, laying out the parameters of what's expected to be worked on and addressed and named, and that also, I think, helps the pastor have a realistic understanding of what he or she needs to be doing in leading the congregation.
Not having to fix everything.
Right, I don't have, and you know, and there were some things in that congregation that I could not help them with. They didn't want to be helped with some things, they had it all figured out, so they thought. And I had to be comfortable leaving that crap alone.
Yeah.
I would also recommend that to the cabinet that they use the response team in those situations. When someone goes into a church that's had this kind of trauma, these are experts. These are people who really have experience, they know what they're doing, and to have them be connected to the pastor going into a traumatic situation could be very helpful. Did you want to say something, Sue?
Again, coming out of that early experience, a couple of times, and we didn't even have the terminology after pastor, but the pastor who went in either was totally unprepared and ill-equipped, like in that first situation, or in the second one I dealt with, the pastor that immediately followed refused to let anyone come and help. He refused the response team. I understand that probably couldn't happen nowadays, but just beware that that pastor he didn't want to let people talk about it. We're just going to put it behind us and move on, was what I heard time and time again, because they didn't understand the dynamics and the psychology behind it all and all of that. And it did not go real well. It wasn't a disaster. He did not leave in a wheelchair, but it still did not go really well. And it wasn't until the subsequent pastor went into that church that some healing was able to happen.
And even though things have changed and we don't do things the way that we used to, and that I think we've gotten a little bit better about some of these pieces, the reality is if we're not vigilant,
Right.
it could be so easy for a cabinet to not be so transparent or intentional, or to invite in the response team when necessary, to kind of overrule a voice within the church that says, no, we don't need the response team. And then for the DS to say, oh, absolutely do. I mean, so it's, I think that part of seeing from where we've come is the reminder of how we need to not return.
Right.
Right, thank you.
Is there ever care for after pastors' families?
Care for after?
You know, in our own situation, my husband was sort of put in a place where he became an after pastor. He didn't really know that. But a lot of the anger wasn't directed to him, it was directed to me. Because I was here. I wasn't the person in that situation.
Wow.
Which was fine for me because I knew where it was coming from and didn't much bother me.
That's
But I'm thinking that in some cases, that could have really
That's excellent. That's an excellent point, and we should pursue that. I think that's something we should pursue, and we'll talk about that maybe with the cabinet training. We can maybe kind of approach that at that point. One other thing before Sean does his thing, we've talked a little bit about a case where the pastor was innocent. And we've talked about that a couple of times today because it's fresh for us. It's only been a year or so since that happened. And it was traumatic. It was just a nasty, horrible, ugly situation, and the people who were involved in it are still twitching. So it was ugly. But that almost never happens. I've been on the team for 15, 16 years. That's the only time that ever happened. And it was a situation where a third party made an accusation about a pastor. I just want you to be very clear that almost every time there's a complaint, there is evidence, or a pastor is, there's a complaint and a pastor is suspended. There is sufficient evidence for us to go in and believing that there's something going on here. That was the only situation in the 15 years that I've been here. How many years have you?
More than I want to count.
I've never heard any, and I've heard all the stories, because as you can tell, we tell the stories over again every time we do training because they touch our hearts. They break our hearts. And we tell these stories over and over again every time we do training, and when we get together for meetings, we remember the time, because those are stories that break our hearts, and we keep needing to unwind with each other. We keep needing to tell each other the stories again and again, because that's who we are and that's what we do. But it's important to do that. But I do want you to recognize that it's a very rare occasion that there's a case that's unfounded. And that case was determined unfounded by the bishop, who sent a letter to the congregation and let them know that, so that there was no question that was. Yes, ma'am.
I think I read that letter in person.
You did?
Yeah.
You did? Yes, because as you were reading the letter to one congregation, you got a text from the person who made the complaint saying, I'm going to complain again. I'm like, oh. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but anyway.
What's being passed around is our conference media response templates. I know that those won't really hold true for every situation, but it's a good kind of starting place for if a situation happens and word gets out and the media contacts you in whatever capacity you're in. Basically, the place to start with is you do not need to respond in the moment. That is Well, and speaking as a recovering journalist, it was my last job, was TV news. So I know where they're coming from, and you have 3, 4, 5 deadlines every single day. So they'll have urgency in any call that they make to you. But just know that you have every right to take time to give them information, and that after that call happens, by all means, my contact information is at the bottom of that sheet. Thank you. By all means, call me, and I can walk you through the process, and we'll work on some kind of official response together. So, like that first, if it's a phone call, first, take a written message so you have, you get details. Ask know who they are, because a lot of times, like I said, if they are moving quickly, you might just hear kind of what paper or what TV station they're from. Make sure you get all those pertinent pieces of information, their direct phone number. Most important thing that sometimes reporters will not volunteer is, when's your deadline? As in, if it's a newspaper, is your deadline tonight for tomorrow morning? Are you a TV reporter? Is it for the 11 o'clock news? So you have to have something by 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock that evening, or is it longer? Do you have more time? And then that kind of gives you and I kind of a window as to how long we have to put something together. Obviously, ask for the topic, so you know where they're coming from, what kind of background information they've gleaned from members of the community, anything like that. A church spokesperson will return their call. That would be me. I'm here to support you. I would rather you not speak on your own church's behalf. Let me do that from the conference level, just to give a little bit more, just to back you up, and then that doesn't put you in a position where the media can come back to you and, kind of bombard you with questions and things, and kind of hang you out in a situation where you don't want to be in. So if we respond from a conference level, there's a lot more kind of clout behind it and things. Again, don't answer questions yourself. Be polite, but be firm. Again, most likely they will be persistent, so it's okay to be persistent back. And keep a log or written record of all the calls that you receive, when they happened, who they were, things like that. This hold response is just kind of the generic, like I said, to give yourself time, to give us time to craft something, basically. If a representative of the media calls or approaches an employee or volunteer even, everybody should know about this. In whatever avenue they serve, they should always, if it's a volunteer, obviously they'll probably refer them to the pastor. The pastor should then come to my office. If they seek comment or ask questions about an incident or suspect child abuse or vulnerable adult abuse, etc., should not provide any comments. Also, do not say no comment. Please do not say no comment.
What should we say instead?
You should say, in red down there, the conference can best respond to you, so I direct you to the Office of Communications for the Susquehanna Conference, and we'll handle it from there.
Now, wasn't it before that the choir was contacted for the... Yeah. I'm the new Jerry, so yeah. Yes. I don't... Yeah, I know. I'm aware, yeah. Again, don't say no comment, because that leaves ambiguity in terms of, oh, well, you didn't respond one way or another, so therefore it must be you're hiding something. So that in red there is a good way to at least hopefully just give them something to work with. And again, it gives us time. If reporters or anybody approaches you on your church property or anything, refer those questions to your pastor, have them call me directly, or your district superintendent. It's part of the process, I know, I'm sorry. Again,
just to say it again, be polite but firm. Don't communicate your personal opinion in any way. Don't speculate. Again, that just gives fodder to a story that we don't want to have out there. So, again, don't make any attempt to speak off the record. If the reporter asks you, couldn't you say anything off the record? Please decline. Just no. I can't speak off the record on this. Everything needs to be recorded, especially in situations where this would happen. Again, don't ever respond with no comment. Casual conversations or questions about a crisis. Again, don't speculate. And again, don't feel obligated. Don't feel like you're obligated to respond to questions. If you don't know, it's better to not say anything. And again, I'll help you respond. I can respond for you, or I can help you craft a kind of brief, positive, general statement that will at least kind of hopefully quell some fears and things from there. And again, I think, as what we talked about it earlier, if it's a meeting and you have, say it's a church meeting and you know that members of your congregation are media members, if their day job is they're a reporter for the newspaper, for the TV station, make sure you know where if they come to the meeting, make sure you know what capacity they're serving in when they get there. You know, it's okay to stop them at the door and say, I know you're attending as a member tonight. Who are you serving? Are you here as a member, or are you here for your job? And if they say, I'm here for my job, our policy is reporters, please step out of the meeting. Pastor or I will brief you afterwards, basically because those church meetings are closed and they're not open to the public where media can get to. So we can hold them in a place and, again, give them information that they would need to go kind of get what they need. So any questions with that?
Sean,
yes, ma'am.
So in my experience,
yes.
In addition to the statement you made earlier about having statements and responses come from you, from your office, right, because of the cloud of the conference responding. Additionally, I think what it also provides is a consistent message.
Yeah.
And also gives the opportunity to shape the message.
Absolutely.
So that it can potentially be helpful depending on what the situation is, but also can guard against some potential opening up for future or further liability.
Of course, yeah.
And so I think that all of those pieces as well, I think help us to remind ourselves how important it is that we come back to the director of communication, right, to guide that conversation with the media as opposed to right, our involvement. Because there's so much more harm that we can cause, and so we probably need to stay in our own lanes.
Right. Yeah.
And that's your lane.
Yeah, of course, but that also means that I will be working directly with you as well. It's not like
right,
you hand it off to me and I never talk to you again. Like, we'll be in that conversation, you know, through the whole process, probably several times, to say, you know, here, and like we talked about earlier with the letters, those get passed around multiple people. Same thing will happen with statements to the media. They will get crafted one way, get passed around, we can change them, but then ultimately they will come out of my office to whoever the media people are, and then, so it is a process, but yeah, good point, thank you.
I think one other thing, talking about consistency, I think the statement in red here is excellent, and I think it seems like, you know, when I do church conferences by myself and talk about safe sanctuaries, I always talk about how to communicate with the media. If something happens, this is a really good statement that could be part of our church safe sanctuaries policy, so people know exactly what.
It should be.
Yeah, you mean it is part of the policy?
Should be.
Pretty sure, yeah.
Okay, so I don't see it in the ones that I see in the in our churches. I don't see this answer, this particular statement in there.
Okay, I can.
I've seen it in the policy book, I thing.
In the policy book, okay. So, you know, maybe we should push a little bit to make sure that people who are working in the churches in places with children.
This just came out to all the districts and.
Yes.
And, you know, I've printed it out, it's sitting beside, you know, my computer on my desk. That would be a great place, you know, to have that sitting beside telephones.
Yeah.
And I can work on that. From the conference, I can work in our office to get to the right people in our conference office, especially for Safe Sanctuary.
Okay, that'd be great. That'd be great if it, you know, just in the churches, each individual church would notice that this is in their Safe Sanctuary policy would be great. Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions or anything? Or?
I have a question that relates to or comes out of an experience that Mike and I have had recently in supporting a couple of survivors in dealing with the Western North Carolina Conference around a very old sexual misconduct issue. The survivors, in this case, contacted the media a number of months ago. They actually didn't tell us until after we had spent some time with them and been present with them in a meeting with conference officials. But it has turned out that the reporter, who was a special reporter for the religion section of his newspaper, really went after all of the principals in this case to interview them. So he wanted to interview the bishop's assistant. He wanted to interview an old district superintendent. He wanted to interview the current pastor at the church where the abuse had taken place. And I wonder, lots and lots of people. Right. And I wonder how our conference would handle that if there were a case where a reporter specifically didn't want just a statement from the conference, but wanted to review ancient history that the conference wouldn't necessarily have, but an individual would have. How might that be handled? Could you be present with a pastor?
Absolutely.
When an interview is taking place?
And
if that were authorized?
Right. If that would ever come up, and it wouldn't be, I just stand back and let the pastor talk. It would be, pastor and I would talk and kind of coach them through what
beforehand.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And hopefully, you know, if somebody's that dogged, hopefully, you know, do have to kind of cross that bridge when you come to it. But in those situations, I would definitely want to be there, just to hopefully, again, craft that message and just kind of make it as good as it can for the conference level. But that's something that I'll look into, especially.
Keep an eye out for this because it's coming out. We were told that it's expected a series of articles about an old case coming out of Charlotte, North Carolina.
But there's a connection here, right?
There's
and I think that's why. It's not just because it's happening in the United Methodist Church in another conference. There's a direct connection with this conference.
I'll have to get in touch with you in terms of specifics then.
We'll tell you more about that.
Okay.
Yeah, and we'll let you know when we see the article.
Right, that'll be perfect, thank you. And that also doesn't mean, I've told people this as well, if, this is sort of unrelated, but if your church is having a fundraiser and the media shows up to cover a good story, you don't have to contact me. That's okay.
Good point.
So, I mean, it's not an every single case that I need to know, but, you know, obviously use your best judgment if you're not sure. It's better safe than sorry, but yeah. Any other questions or anything? You have extras if you need extras of our policy too.